I rise today to note the anniversary of an unfortunate event that is undermining the very core of our cherished democracy. This past Saturday marked the 2-year anniversary of the Supreme Court's disastrous 5-4 decision in a case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. With that feat of judicial activism, the conservative bloc of the Supreme Court gnawed a hole in the dike protecting our elections' integrity, overturned the will of Congress and the American people, and allowed unlimited, anonymous, corporate money to flood into our elections. Senator McCain recently called this, quote, one of the worst decisions in history. Senator Schumer said at the time, quote, one thing is clear, the conservative bloc of the Supreme Court has predetermined the outcome of the next election. The winners will be the corporations. It's no secret around here that big corporate interests long have had oversized influence in the legislative and executive branches. But Citizens United supersizes that influence so that it threatens to overrun our elections. Here's how my home state newspaper, the Providence Journal, explained it. The ruling will mean that more than ever, big spending economic interests will determine who gets elected. More money will especially pour into relentless attack campaigns. Free speech for most individuals will suffer because their voices will count for even less than they do now. They will simply be drowned out by the big money. This election year already confirms those fears. Senator McCain noted earlier this month, I'll quote him again, I predicted when the United States Supreme Court, with their absolute ignorance of what happens in politics, struck down the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, that there would be a flood of money into campaigns, not transparent, unaccounted for, and this is exactly what is happening. And I predict that in the future there will be scandals because there is too much money washing around political campaigns now that nobody knows where it came from and nobody knows where it's going. Senator McCain got it right. Look at Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. This election cycle has been the coming out party for the super PACs, the so-called evil twins of candidates' campaigns. Why evil twins? Because unlike candidates' campaigns, super PACs can accept unlimited corporate cash. Unlike candidates' campaigns, super PACs can hide the identities of who's funding them until long after the voting is over. And unlike candidates' campaigns, super PACs can run vicious and misleading advertisements without anyone being accountable to the voters. Super PACs supposedly can't coordinate their activities with the candidates' campaigns. But we all know this is pure fiction. In practice, they're run by close confederates of the candidates, fueled by the same donors, and acting in perfect harmony with the campaigns. And it's out of control. Through the date of the New Hampshire primary, super PACs backing the Republican presidential candidates spent over $14 million, far more than the candidates' campaigns did themselves. Here's the problem. Corporations are not people. By refusing to acknowledge this, the Citizens United opinion has undermined the integrity of our democracy, allowing unlimited corporate money to drown out ordinary citizens' voices. And this isn't some unfortunate side effect of a long-standing right enshrined in our Constitution. This is new and this is novel. The founders certainly did not consider corporations to be citizens of our democracy. Corporations are not even mentioned in the Constitution once. Indeed, private business corporations were actually rare at our nation's founding. As Justice Stevens noted in his dissent in Citizens United, it is implausible that the framers believed the freedom of speech would extend equally to all corporate speakers, much less that it would preclude legislatures from taking limited measures to guard against corporate capture of elections. So there is really no case to support the Citizens United decision if you're an originalist. Federal laws have restricted corporate spending on campaigns since 1907. The principle that an inanimate business corporation is not allowed to spend unlimited dollars to influence political campaigns is a long-established cornerstone of our political system, from Teddy Roosevelt a century ago to Senators McCain and Feingold in our time, who won that bruising legislative battle for the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Citizens United overturned not just all that legislation, but also overturned a long line of judicial decisions upholding those restrictions on corporate cash in elections. So there's no case here based on precedent either. Justice Stevens noted that, and I'll quote him again, "The only relevant thing that has changed since those prior precedents that were overruled is the composition of this court." End quote. The conservatives got a majority of 5, and they ran with it. Judicial activism, pure, plain, and simple. The activism appears pretty nakedly in the majority's findings of fact. Just for starters, a Supreme Court is not supposed to make findings of fact. Its role is to review the factual record presented to it and interpret the law. But the Supreme Court's conservative bloc nevertheless made findings of fact in Citizens United. Here's one. We now conclude that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. They just declared that to be true. Really? So a company comes in, drops a couple of $1 million to smear one candidate on behalf of the other in a closely contested race, tips the election, and you don't think that that other candidate they helped is in that company's pocket? Please. And say a year later, that company comes back and it sits down quietly with the congressman and it says, "You remember that ad we ran smearing your opponent last year that helped you win the election? Well, here's one we're going to run against you through a different phony shell organization unless you vote with us on this bill." No possibility of corruption or the appearance of corruption? Please, it is ludicrous. It is patently false. Here's another finding of fact by this block of judges. The appearance of influence or access, furthermore, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. If all you're doing is listening to the corporations, people are going to be fine with that. Please, anyone in politics knows how phony that statement is. There are hundreds of thousands of pages of findings to the contrary in the records of the previous Supreme Court decisions that were overturned and from legislative hearings. Here's what the Senate said 100 years ago, speaking about corporate money in elections. "The evils of the use of this money in connection with political elections are so generally recognized that the committee deems it unnecessary to make any argument in favor of the general purpose of this measure. It is in the interest of good government and calculated to promote purity in the selection of public officials." This finding of the Senate was magically overturned by the Citizens United 5. Other courts are having trouble swallowing this phony fact-finding. The Montana Supreme Court recently rejected this false premise that underlies Citizens United. Here's what they said. Clearly, the impact of unlimited corporate donations creates a dominating impact on the political process and inevitably minimizes the impact of individual citizens. Now that is true. But the conservative justices comprising the Citizens United 5 had to make these unsupported findings of fact. They are the analytical linchpin of the Citizens United decision. Without the pretense that corporate money could never corrupt or appear to corrupt elections, the rest of their analysis falls to pieces, and they would never have been able to open the floodgates for the big corporations. May I have an additional 2 minutes, please?
Without objection.
So they had to make these findings, even though the findings were contrary to precedent, contrary to common sense, contrary to fact. Americans of all political stripes are disgusted by the influence of unlimited, anonymous corporate cash in our elections. Rhode Islander Charles, I'll just use his first name, in Little Compton, wrote to me, "It is wrong that someone who shouts louder or further, in this instance solely because they have more money, should drown out another person. Corporations have no problems getting their views aired." Hope Whitney in Bristol wrote to me, "Just the idea that a corporation is considered an individual in regards to politics goes against everything American to me. They have become the emperors, as they have the financial ability to be heard everywhere. I'd be willing to bet that a majority of their own employees do not agree with their political representation." As Elizabeth in Wakefield, Rhode Island wrote, "Big business should not control our elections. It is bad enough that they deeply influence our politicians through lobbyists." Madam President, Rhode Islanders, like Americans across the country, have had enough. In 2010, we came within one vote in this chamber of passing the Disclose Act, which would have at least kept the corporate cash from flooding our elections anonymously. This year, let's redouble our efforts to limit the damage done by Citizens United. We must, if we're to preserve democracy of the people, by the people, and for the people from this tide of unlimited, unaccountable, and anonymous corporate money polluting our elections. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the floor.